Southern Germany, April 1945. Morning arrived slowly across the rolling German countryside. A thin fog rested over the fields. Burned vehicles lined the narrow roads. The smell of smoke still lingered from the night before. In the distance, the low rumble of armored engines broke the silence. Elements of the U.S. Third Army were moving again. For weeks, General George S. Patton's forces had pushed relentlessly across Germany. Villages fell in hours. Towns surrendered before resistance formed. German defenses were collapsing faster than Allied planners had predicted. The men riding those tanks looked different now. Their uniforms were worn. Their boots were covered in dried mud, faces unshaven, eyes tired. These were frontline soldiers who had crossed rivers, fought through artillery fire, and driven deep into the heart of Nazi Germany. As the column slowed near a secured military camp, a different scene appeared. Inside the perimeter, everything looked orderly. Guards stood in formation. Officers wore clean uniforms. Vehicles were parked neatly along the road. The contrast was immediate. Then, as Patton's combat veterans entered the camp, a senior camp commander stepped forward. His posture was rigid, his expectations clear. He issued a formal order. He expected the passing soldiers to salute. But the column kept moving. No one raised a hand. Engines rumbled. Tracks rolled forward. Boots continued walking. The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but it revealed a tension that had been building for months, because this was more than a missed salute. It was the moment when battle-hardened soldiers met rear area authority, and neither side expected what would happen next. Germany, spring 1945. By April 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing faster than anyone had expected. Across Western Germany, Allied forces were advancing with overwhelming momentum. Cities that once symbolized German industrial strength were now falling one after another. Resistance still existed, but it was fragmented. Many German units were retreating, surrendering, or simply disappearing into the countryside. Among the fastest advancing forces was the U.S. Third Army under George S. Patton. Patton had built his reputation on speed. His philosophy was simple: move faster than the enemy could react. His armored divisions pushed forward day and night, often advancing dozens of miles in a single day. This pace placed enormous strain on the soldiers who carried out the advance. Tank crews slept inside their vehicles. Infantrymen moved on foot for hours without rest. Supply trucks struggled to keep up with the rapid movement. Fuel shortages became common, yet the advance rarely stopped for long. By late March 1945, Third Army forces had crossed the Rhine River, a major barrier that German planners had hoped would slow the Allied advance. Instead, the crossing accelerated the collapse of organized resistance in Western Germany. Once across the Rhine, Patton's forces spread into central and southern Germany. Towns surrendered quickly. Bridges were captured intact. German command structures were breaking down under pressure from multiple Allied advances. But the speed of the advance created another reality. Frontline units often moved far ahead of established command and administrative areas. Rear area camps, supply depots, and military headquarters were sometimes caught off guard by the sudden arrival of combat troops. These rear area installations operated under different conditions. Unlike frontline soldiers, many camp personnel lived in relatively stable environments. Their uniforms remained clean. Their routines followed structured military discipline. Formal gestures like salutes, inspections, and protocol were maintained more strictly. To them, discipline meant order. To Patton's advancing soldiers, discipline meant survival. Weeks of continuous combat had shaped the behavior of these troops. They were focused on movement, security, and speed. formal gestures often faded in importance compared to battlefield awareness. This growing contrast between front-line and rear-area culture became more visible as the war neared the end. And on certain days, when these two worlds suddenly met, the difference could become impossible to ignore. By the spring of 1945, the United States Army in Europe had become something larger than planners originally imagined. Millions of men were spread across the continent. Some fought at the front, others maintained supply lines, guarded camps, managed prisoners, or coordinated logistics. On paper, they all wore the same uniform, but in reality, their experiences had shaped them into very different kinds of soldiers. Front-line soldiers, especially those serving under Patton's Third Army, had been moving almost continuously since the breakout from the Normandy invasion in June 1944. They had crossed France, fought through Belgium, endured the freezing winter during the Battle of the Bulge, and then surged into Germany. These men had seen constant combat. Their discipline came from battlefield necessity. They watched the horizon for threats. They reacted to sudden artillery fire. They learned to trust movement, instinct, and experience more than formal procedure. Meanwhile, rear area units operated differently. Camp commanders were responsible for maintaining order within controlled environments. Their duties included security, administration, and enforcement of military standards. For them, discipline was visible. Clean uniforms, structured formations, proper protocol. Salutes between ranks were part of maintaining authority and hierarchy. This difference was not unusual in large armies, but by April 1945, the contrast had grown sharper. Patton himself emphasized aggressive movement above all else. He encouraged
challenge to authority. And soon, the tension would become impossible to ignore. By now, the entire roadside had fallen silent. More vehicles rolled through the camp gates: tank destroyers, armored cars, supply trucks. Each one passed the commander without acknowledgement. The steady movement of the Third Army continued, as if the expectation of formal protocol simply did not exist. The camp commander remained still, watching. His authority within the camp was absolute. Orders were followed, discipline maintained, salutes were routine. But now, in front of his own personnel, an entire column of frontline troops moved past without recognition. The contrast became increasingly visible. Rear area soldiers stood in formation, observing the passing column. Their uniforms were pressed, their boots polished. They followed routine discipline every day. Yet the men passing them looked entirely different, hardened by combat, focused, and uninterested in ceremony. The psychological divide was clear. Some of the camp personnel began to glance at one another. The tension was subtle but present. The commander's authority depended on visible respect, and now that respect seemed absent, not through defiance, but through indifference. More infantry units passed. Some soldiers briefly scanned rooftops and surrounding fields, habits formed from weeks of combat. Their eyes moved constantly, searching for threats even in a secured area. To them, this was still enemy territory. Saluting meant lowering awareness, even briefly. Combat veterans understood that risk. As the final elements of the column entered the camp, a senior Third Army officer followed behind in a jeep. His vehicle slowed momentarily, assessing the situation. He observed the silent roadside, the rigid posture of the commander, the steady movement of his own troops. The moment was understood without words. Patton's army moved differently. Speed, aggression, and survival had reshaped behavior. Formal gestures, while still respected, often became secondary in forward combat zones. This was not a breakdown of discipline, it was a different form of discipline, shaped by battlefield experience. The last vehicle passed. Engines faded slowly into the distance. The camp commander remained standing, No salute had been given. No confrontation had occurred. But the message had been clear. These were Patton's men. They respected combat experience above formal hierarchy. And in that brief, quiet moment, authority had shifted. Not through defiance, but through the silent confidence of soldiers who had spent months at the front. But not for long. The column moved beyond the camp and disappeared down the narrow German road. Inside the compound, the atmosphere slowly returned to routine. Guards resumed their positions. Officers returned to administrative duties. Yet the quiet moment lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it. For many in the camp, the encounter revealed something difficult to ignore. The soldiers of the Third Army did not look like traditional military formations. They looked like men shaped entirely by war. Their movements were cautious, their attention focused outward, their priorities were different. They were not ignoring discipline, they were practicing a different kind of discipline, one built from survival. By April 1945, forces under George S. Patton had advanced hundreds of miles across Europe. They had crossed the Rhine River, liberated towns, and encountered scattered resistance as German defenses collapsed. Their speed had become legendary. But that speed came with a cost: fatigue, continuous movement, constant alertness. These conditions shaped how soldiers behaved even in areas considered secure. Formalities, while still understood, often faded behind immediate battlefield awareness. For the camp commander, the moment passed without confrontation. There were no disciplinary reports, no formal complaints. The war was ending. Priorities were shifting toward final operations and occupation duties. Yet the quiet moment quietly reflected something larger. The war had created two kinds of soldiers within the same army: those shaped by routine and those shaped by combat. And as the Third Army continued its advance deeper into Germany, that difference became increasingly visible. Within weeks, Germany would surrender. But moments like this remained. Small, quiet reminders of how months of war had changed men, reshaped authority, and redefined what respect looked like on the battlefield. Because by the spring of 1945, Patton's men were no longer just soldiers. They were veterans of a war that was finally coming to an end. War changes armies in ways that are not always visible on maps. By the spring of 1945, the Allied advance across Germany had become unstoppable. Cities fell, resistance weakened, the end of the war in Europe was approaching quickly. Yet behind these large movements were smaller moments, quiet encounters that revealed how deeply the conflict had shaped the men fighting it. The brief tension inside that camp was one of those moments. It was not a battle. No shots were fired, no orders were openly challenged. Yet the silence between a commander and passing soldiers revealed something profound. The men of George S. Patton's Third Army had spent months in constant combat. They had learned to move quickly, stay alert, and trust instinct over formality. Their discipline had been forged under artillery fire, during river crossings, and through long advances into uncertain territory. In contrast, the camp represented structure and order, the traditional foundation of military authority. Neither side was wrong, but the war had created different priorities. For frontline soldiers, survival and movement came first. For rear area command, protocol maintained control. And when those two worlds met, even a simple salute became a reflection of deeper change. Within weeks, Germany surrendered in May 1945. The fighting in Europe ended. Soldiers who had crossed continents began transitioning to occupation duties or preparing to return home. Formal discipline would again become central to daily military life. But the experiences of those final months remained. Moments like this, quiet, brief, and almost unnoticed, captured the human reality of war. They showed how authority, respect, and discipline could evolve under pressure.
Because sometimes in war, respect is not given automatically. It is shaped by experience. And by the spring of 1945, Patton's men had earned theirs on battlefields across Europe, long before they ever reached that quiet camp road in Germany.
For frontline soldiers, survival and movement came first. For rear area command, protocol maintained control. When those two worlds met, even a simple salute became a reflection of deeper change. Within weeks, Germany surrendered in May 1945. The fighting in Europe ended. Soldiers who had crossed continents began transitioning to occupation duties or preparing to return home. Formal discipline would again become central to daily military life. But the experiences of those final months remained. Moments like this, quiet, brief, and almost unnoticed, captured the human reality of war. They showed how authority, respect, and discipline could evolve under pressure. Because sometimes in war, respect is not given automatically. It is shaped by experience. And by the spring of 1945, Patton's men had earned theirs on battlefields across Europe, long before they ever reached that quiet camp road in Germany.